Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome to the latest of our Lunchtime Live series. I'm Rob from Zero Waste Leeds and I'm really pleased today that Dr Henry Irving from Leeds Beckett University is joining us today to take a bit of a long view on obviously a topic that we talk about a lot, which is around waste and recycling and waste reduction. And Henry's got a lot of expertise and kind of background looking at this, particularly during the Second World War. So Henry, welcome today.
Afternoon, thank you for having me, Rob.
No, thank you. I mean, just before we get into the conversation, just to explain a little bit for people who might be new to Zero Waste Leeds, we're looking to build a movement in the city to help Leeds become a zero waste city by 2030. And we've been doing lots of different things involved with a project called Leeds by Example about on-the-go recycling. We've got a project at the moment about school uniform reuse and setting up a network of schemes for that. And then a whole host of different work things, basically kind of tapping into the enthusiasm that we know a lot of people have about wasting less in the city. And we try to basically kind of be a bit of a platform for a lot of those things that are happening in the city. So that's a bit more about us. And we've been doing these kind of chats with people who have got a range of different kind of perspectives and expertise and knowledge on the topic, just to kind of get a bit of discussion kind of going. So Henry, as I say, thank you for joining us. Would you mind just first of all just telling us a little bit about yourself and your particular interest in this kind of topic?
Yeah, of course. So I am a historian. My specialism really is in what we call public history. So it's the way that history is used outside of sort of formal academic settings. And something, Robert, you really should have put this in your introduction. You're very modest because, of course, you've been able to humour me in some of the work that I've done around recycling as well. And it's been a real pleasure over the last couple of years of working with you, thinking about the ways that I can use sort of my knowledge and applying it to some of these contemporary events. That's something that I try to encourage my students to do as well, and thinking really about those connections between the past and the present. And that's something which has really been heightened during the course of the last few months, where particularly at the outset, those links between COVID and the Second World War, they seem to be happening every single day. And so it's something that was at the forefront of my mind, particularly at the beginning of all of this.
Yeah, no, good. Again, and as you say, we I think it was about 12 to 18 months ago, we did a piece of work together. I mean, would you mind just starting by saying a little bit about that and the work on, I think it was around recycling and reuse in Second World War Leeds?
Yeah, it was. So as part of my research, I've been looking at the way that recycling was sort of publicised during the war, the kind of messages that were used to encourage people to be more careful with what they were throwing away. And connected to that, I was able to work with a group of graphic design students, and we produced a series of posters that tried to use the same type of style, but applying it to contemporary waste reduction messages. And yeah, Zero Waste Leeds, you were really sort of helpful with that, sort of acting as a project partner, providing a brief for the students. And then the posters themselves, they went on show at Leeds Town Hall last summer, although it now feels like a very, very long time ago. But thinking about the ways we can connect those messages with contemporary issues.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we spoke again, as you say, just at the start of the COVID epidemic, and you did some kind of more kind of writing on this topic, didn't you, about how to. There was a lot of talk about the Blitz Spirit and the kind of the advantages and disadvantages of trying to learn from that Blitz Spirit idea. I mean, would you mind saying a little bit about that and the Blitz Spirit work that you looked at?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, particularly at the beginning of all of this, that notion of Blitz Spirit, it was common currency. You had politicians, the media, this was something that was being invoked time and time again. I think Matt Hancock, just before the lockdown, he talked about the sort of the pressures that our grandparents' generation had been under, living through the bombing and living through the Blitz. And as a historian, this, on the one hand, it drove me mad because it's really, really difficult to draw an equation between a virus and then the threat from aerial warfare. But on the other hand, there did seem to be something there, particularly around ideas of community. And I think if one good thing has come out of the last few months, it's been that some of the sort of the skepticism about community has been been matched. I mean, we've seen that one of the really sort of positive things to come out of all of this has been the growth of mutual aid groups, the important work that's been done by voluntary organisations, and people just being more aware of, you know, what their neighbours are up to. And I think that was something, again, as a historian, I sort of tapped into, and thinking about some of the positives that we could take from this as well. So by no means is that idea of Blitz Spirit a sort of simplistic thing that you can apply in different settings, but it did seem to have at least as many positives as it had negatives. So yeah, thinking about that and thinking about the way that we could also sort of harness it and work with it today.
Yeah, no, I thought that was really interesting in terms of, because particularly right at the start, obviously we were less connected to each other than any of us have felt in our whole lives, really. But you're right that our online networks became kind of really important, and also those kind of connections. I think a lot of us probably know our neighbours better now than we did, you know, 12 to 18 weeks ago, because we've found different ways to connect with each other, even though the normal ways are often quite kind of hard.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Some of that is circumstantial, but you can't ignore it. And I think this is, as a historian looking at the Second World War, a lot of the things that people were experiencing then, they probably wouldn't have thought of as that historically significant. But for us, you know, 80 years later, looking back, it seems particularly significant. I think that's the really interesting thing when you start to project forward and imagine, well, what will people make of the times that we've been living through? In some ways, it is those, you know, those meaningful connections. That stuff is just as important as the kind of the big picture, so the policy and all of those types of things. Yeah. So I think, that idea of Blitz Spirit, there's something there, even if it is quite problematic.
Yeah, and just, I mean, linking the 2 points really. I mean, the work we did with you was around the kind of, you know, messaging and the campaign messages and the posters and all that kind of thing. And I suppose it's quite interesting to think about how you get messages across in a crisis, and the World War was the ultimate kind of crisis. But whether there, as you say, there are things we can learn kind of now, you know, talking specifically about kind of how you encourage people to waste, sorry, a fly going past me there, to waste less. Because I mean, I read something you put out a couple of weeks ago, kind of talking about the obviously one of the issues at the moment is about suddenly a lot more plastic waste. I mean, would you mind telling us a bit about this latest piece of
of course,
that you've done?
Yeah, and I suppose the concept here, another of the reasons why these sort of links to the Blitz were so common is because we are going through a period of anniversaries and sort of marking, you know, 80 years since 1940, 75 years since the end of the war, these sorts of things. And it just happened that a couple of weeks ago, there was an anniversary which was pretty much overlooked, but I think it's really important. It was the anniversary of the moment that local authorities took a statutory responsibility to collect recycling. So this was something that happened during the Second World War in a way that hadn't happened in the First. And it was the first time in Britain that local authorities were forced to actually offer an effective recycling service. So I thought it's worth thinking about this and trying to kind of dig a little bit more deeply. And one of the challenges that was faced at that time, it was about encouraging people to participate, because this was quite new. Not that many people before the war had sort of recycled really anything. So it involved a huge change of behaviour. So alongside the law that was put in place to make local authorities responsible, there was also a huge, I mean, absolutely enormous publicity drive to try and encourage the public to take part. And for me, one of the sort of the standout conclusions from that is that although they attempted to have quite a joined up approach, in the end it fell apart because the publicity was so successful that lots of people wanted to get involved. But unfortunately, the local councils did not have the capacity to deal with it. So as the system broke down, public opinion then shifted. So I think the piece you referred to, it's looking at that paradox, the idea that unfortunately in that moment, the publicity and the structure, they just didn't gel, and that led to a huge number of problems.
Interesting, because you said, I mean, there were some, and again, there are parallels with now, aren't there? There were some waste streams that were easier for local councils to collect. I think paper was fairly well established, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, so paper's the big one. It's relatively clean. It was relatively easy to process. But then there are other things which just, particularly bulkier items of waste, and metals cause real problems because of problems with transport. And
Yeah.
I think this is the intricacies. It caused so many problems because it was relatively new. It was something that hadn't been done on that scale before.
Yeah, interesting. And because there was I think you mentioned about, was there an issue with aluminium recycling? I think the thing that interested me there was something about people losing faith quite quickly that actually things were going to happen to the aluminium that they were collecting. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right. So at the same time that there was this sort of attempt to put in place quite a strategic approach to recycling, other parts of government launched their own slightly more sort of publicity hungry sort of appeals. And one of the big ones, which is, if you talk to the right people, it's still relatively famous. If you talk to historians, was called Pots to Planes, and effectively it was the Minister of Aircraft Production, a man called Lord Beaverbrook, who was a sort of newspaper baron by background, Max Aitken, and he launched this really high-profile appeal for people to donate unwanted cookware, promising that it'd be turned into things like Spitfires. And this had a sort of huge impact. People came flocking to these dumps with a huge number of sort of saucepans, all manner of aluminium sort of items, but it completely overwhelmed the system. And the real challenge was that although there was that sort of short-term immediate engagement from the public, the fact that it overwhelmed the system and these dumps, they stayed. It was impossible for councils to actually process the material. A lot of it then wasn't used for productive means over the summer of 1940. That really damaged public confidence and damaged public trust, because they started to question, well, if this waste that we were told was valuable is just being left there to rot, what about the paper that we're putting out? What about the bones that we're separating? And it led people then to really question the whole system. And I think that there is an important lesson in this between the sort of the short-termism and then those sort of long-term aims, because I think 1940 shows us that sometimes the short-term enthusiasm, it can undermine some of those long-term messages. And this, I think, is where there's that link back to plastic, because we've, over the last few years, we've been talking again and again about how damaging plastic is and how important it is to sort of mitigate that use, to think about alternatives. Of course, what has COVID done? COVID has made plastic much more prevalent, because we're now moving increasingly towards a greater sort of concern about hygiene. Hygiene being associated with single-use plastics. And it just worries me that that sort of short-term push towards plastics going to undermine some of those longer-term ideas and those longer-term ambitions that we've had about waste reduction.
Yeah, interesting. And that is that you can imagine that being quite an issue. Obviously, I mean, you know, single use in terms of PPE and that kind of thing, which again, you can totally understand why we need that kind of stuff. But then there's in terms of the broader arena around, you know, a move back towards kind of single-use coffee cups and that kind of thing. Again, understandable. If you're a coffee shop trying to open up again right now, you want to keep things quite simple. But there are, I think you're right to kind of look at the kind of longer-term implications and think how we try to move back onto the path that we were on before.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is really difficult, and all of these worries are understandable ones. And the last thing that we would want to see is a load of businesses going bust. It's understandable that in this moment people are wanting certainty, and I think this is where actually it's really important to have these conversations. And one of the things that I always think that Zero Waste Leeds has done really well is to keep those conversations going and to remind us that yes, we're going through this immediate crisis, but those longer term issues, they've not gone away. And actually, I think we need to be thinking really carefully about these and, just pushing, if we need to know more science on sort of what's safe, what's not safe, let's go out and find it. This is something which I think there is a possibility to look into. And we need to make sure we don't miss those sorts of messages when we're thinking about all of our attentions on stopping the spread of the virus. We definitely need to think about those longer term issues as well.
No, sure. And again, I mean, that's something I've always found interesting in your work about trying to draw the parallels with communication in an absolute crisis like a world war, which is obviously a very kind of as big a crisis as you could imagine. And then we've got COVID, which is a very kind of, a crisis that we are really kind of living through right now. But hopefully, as we start to, hopefully we'll kind of emerge from this. There is the longer term, environmental crisis, the climate emergency. And I suppose I'm always interested to think what we can learn in terms of communications to try to get message across to people in a slightly different, maybe in some ways less tangible, I don't know, kind of crisis. And I don't know whether there are any lessons from the past on that, or whether we just need to work that out for ourselves.
It's a huge question, isn't it? I think one of the things that, again, as a historian, annoyed me about the Blitz Spirit stuff is that it assumed that people during the war they accepted all of these messages, and they did keep calm and carry on and whatever it may be. As somebody who's looked a lot at the history of wartime propaganda, one of the things that I've come across time and time again is that people were skeptical. They didn't always take these messages to heart. I mean, that famous "keep calm, carry on" poster, it wasn't released during the war, but others in the series were. And people felt that they were the wrong message at the wrong time, that they were patronizing. They felt they didn't need to be told. And actually, what is most effective when you look at some of the wartime propaganda, it's the messages that encourage people to be active. They encourage people to have their own agency. One of the reasons why recycling was such a publicity success in the summer of 1940 is it gave people who were feeling a bit scared and a bit uncertain something to do, something active that they could do to they saw it make a difference in the war. Now, when we kind of look at the current situation, there's been, again, a lot of criticism in some ways of the government's messages, particularly around sort of ambiguity of the sort of stay alert message, these sorts of things. But what people have actually taken to heart have been those opportunities to get involved. If you think of the announcement, whenever it was, middle of March, for the NHS Direct Volunteer Scheme, that saw a huge flurry of volunteers come forward because it gave people something to do. Likewise with the kind of voluntary effort we talked about earlier. And I think also we're starting to see this actually with masks. I've been struck in the last couple of weeks just how the behaviour does seem to be changing. So I went to the supermarket earlier today, and it's striking that compared to 2 weeks ago, it's definitely now a majority of people rather than a minority wearing masks. And that's before the laws have come in, but as there's been more conversation about this. And I think that those opportunities to be active, that's where messages are most effective. So I think one of the, if we're looking at the climate crisis, it is big, it is intangible in some ways, but trying to break that down and look at it from a human level. And I think that was one of the reasons why, some of the thinking behind Zero Waste Leeds, wasn't it, to try to give people a sense that there is, there are active things that we can all do that will have an impact.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing there is about the kind of locally relevant messages as well, isn't it? I'm interested in what, the kind of historical perspective that, local councils becoming more responsible for recycling during the war. There was a bit of communication the council put out last week that said about, a reason to wear a face covering is that there's 45,000 people in Leeds who, are particularly kind of at risk from coronavirus. And I just thought that was a very strong message, and that it brought it home to here and to our city and to people in our city. And I think that the kind of messaging matters, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on actually with regard to the importance of the local messages and all of this. So again, just to keep hammering home this example, 1940, it was a national campaign, but it was one that was delivered locally. So something I wrote about in the piece a couple of weeks ago, there was a whole series of leaflets that were sent out. It was at the end of July, so it had been 80 years ago in a couple of days' time. And these were in most cases hand delivered by volunteers. And at the time that they were delivered, the volunteers would also have a chat with people just to make sure that they understood what was going on, understood exactly what the case was in their local area. Because it was understood that those local messages were much more effective than a national poster campaign. And again, coming back to what I said before, that's kind of, as a historian, it's bizarre in some ways that we have so much fascination with these kind of keep calm, carry on messages, because even at the time, those people who were responsible knew that most people would ignore a sort of national publicity campaign, but they'd be much more willing to listen and much more likely to act if it was a local message and delivered in a local fashion.
No, interesting. I mean, this is a slightly bigger question than just talking about waste and recycling, but I mean, do you feel that the historical perspective beyond just talking about the Blitz Spirit has been kind of listened to nationally? Do you know what I mean? Do you think we are? Do you think there is a sense that we're learning from the past, or you know?
It's a really good question. I think one of the other really big things that, of course, has happened in the last few months has been a real attention to the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly thinking about Britain's own history and history with regard to the slave trade. I think there has been a willingness to listen actually there, and a sort of a willingness to go away and to reflect and to explore some of those links. In general terms, though, I think there's often and I'm sitting here thinking about this from the kind of the perspective of public history. This is something I teach about, and I always tell myself, history has a huge amount of currency. I think history has a huge amount of respect within Britain. People do allude to, you know, historical examples, historical lessons, and whether we actually learn from them, I think is another thing entirely.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's more work for us as historians to do as well to get those messages out.
No, it's interesting. I mean, and we can only speak from our perspective that we've, you know, the reason we keep coming back to you is that we do find that perspective really interesting, both specifically for waste and recycling, but I just think in how we change things as a society, we do need to look in a slightly deeper way to, you know, at things that went before. Not just believe that, you know, it happened before, therefore we need to try and recreate it and do it again. Sometimes we need to just look back and say, actually, we made some big mistakes there. Let's make sure we don't repeat them. You know?
I think that, yeah, and also thinking forwards. I mean, this is something that I have increasingly been thinking about. And say it's kind of connected to COVID, because I know that this is going to be a moment that people will come back to. You know, our lives are going to be studied in the same way that many of our ancestors' lives are. And what are people going to make of it? You know, what are people going to think that we did a good job with all of this? Are people going to think that we we missed a trick? And I think understanding that our lives can also shape, you know, what comes next, I think that's important. It's not just the same as saying, oh, we've got to do this for, you know, our children's generation, our grandchildren's generation. It's that we're also going to be judged in this, in the same way that we might look back at people like Edward Colston and sort of judge their actions and think, well, how could that be seen as moral at the time? So I think that historical perspective, that long view, it can be important, because it shows that as much as our local communities are important, we're also acting as you know, in a sort of temporal community, because those people that came before us and those people that come after us, they're also going to be kind of connected to our actions in some way. So I think, yeah, the one, it's both a blessing and a curse, because as a historian, you can never get away from these things. You're always thinking about those big questions, and that can, yeah, it can make you sort of worry in some ways as it can give you any answers.
Yeah, no, interesting stuff. No, good. I mean, are there any, and again, this is probably too simplistic a question, but in terms of any other, you know, lessons from, you know, the past, in terms of the kind of World War II period, in terms of some of the messaging and the things we do with Zero Waste Leeds, are there any particular things that we've not talked about that come to mind for you?
I mean, really, it's probably just to reiterate some of the things that have already been done. So the importance of local messages, making this tangible at a human scale. I think the importance of direct contact, and actually events like this are quite good in a way. It is, you know, a little bit far removed, but at least you're putting, you know, people are able to put faces to names and kind of understand those ideas. But there's nothing better than personal contact. I think that's certainly from the Second World War, one of the most effective forms of publicity was just the word of mouth, the way that people sort of passed on those messages. I think also the importance of being able to take action. So not just that there's this big, you know, big scary problem that needs to be resolved, but there's also tangible things that you can do, even if they seem relatively small scale. But I think we've talked before, haven't we, about the importance of kind of once you aggregate all of those small actions, like impact, and also probably the importance of repetition and repeating messages through different channels. I think this is something which it's difficult, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you don't want to treat people as sort of unable to take messages, but you don't want to sort of to keep going over the same ground. But I think repetition actually, it is important, and I think we see that again, come back to COVID with some of the stuff around face masks. I mean, this is a debate that's been going on for months, but it's only really as it seems to be getting more important. Those messages are being repeated, that kind of people's actions.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's one we talk about quite a lot in terms of, you know, how many different ways can you talk about bins? Do you know what I mean? There's a limit, but actually you do need to keep, you know, particularly with the movement building idea, you want to always be open to new people joining you, new people who may not have heard that message before, new people who didn't quite take it in the first time or whatever. And I think that kind of really matters. I think the other thing is about hearing messages from different people as well. So I mean, I think one thing we're really continuing to push through Zero Waste Leeds is this idea of sharing our platform. So yeah, it's me talking today, but we do a lot of, we try really hard to basically have a platform for other people to say about the good stuff that they're doing. And I think we respond when we see people a bit like ourselves, people who live in our city, who are doing something. I think that often inspires us to kind of do stuff. But yeah, good. Well, Henry, can I just could I round it up there and just say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you again for having me. So always a pleasure.
Yeah, no, sure. And what we'll do after this, this chat will be on the Facebook group, on the Facebook page after this, and we'll put links to some of the things that you've done before, a couple of chats you've had with us as well, so people can kind of follow up. Kind of more.
Definitely, and if people want to get in touch with me directly, more than welcome to. I'm not particularly good on Facebook, but my details are pretty easy to find. So yeah,
we'll find your details. Yeah, nice one. Okay, well, thanks very much, Henry. Good to see you.
Nice to see you. Cheers, Rob.
All right, thanks. See you. Bye bye.